The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Whitmore Conservatory's main practice hall, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. The grand piano stood in the center like a gleaming black island, its lid propped open to release the cascade of notes, flowing from the fingers of the young woman seated at the keyboard. Sophia Reyes frowned. As her hands stumbled over the same difficult passage for the 5th time, she brushed a strand of dark hair from her face and tried again, her frustration growing with each attempt. The piece, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, was notoriously difficult, but Sophia wasn't used to struggling. Music had always come naturally to her, as effortlessly as breathing. "That's not right," she muttered, striking the keys harder this time, as if force alone could bend the notes to her will. From the corner of her eye, she noticed movement, the steady back-and-forth sweep of a mop across the far side of the hall. She'd forgotten about the janitor, a quiet old man who seemed to fade into the background of the conservatory like a faded note. He kept his head down as he worked, moving slowly around the perimeter of the room, careful not to disturb her practice. Sophia returned her attention to the piano, determined to master the troublesome section before her friends arrived. As a third-year student at the most prestigious music academy in the country, she had a reputation to maintain. Her professors called her a prodigy. Her classmates both admired and envied her. Failure wasn't an option. The door to the practice hall swung open and 3 students walked in, talking and laughing. Priya, Sophia's roommate, waved as they approached the piano. "How's it going? Ready for the showcase next month?" Priya asked, leaning against the piano. Sophia sighed dramatically and tossed her sheet music onto the bench beside her. "This passage is impossible. Listen." She positioned her hands over the keys and began to play, moving confidently through the opening bars before stumbling once again at the same spot. The flowing melody dissolved into a jumble of wrong notes. "I don't get it," she said, throwing up her hands. "I've been working on this section for weeks." "Maybe you're overthinking it," suggested Liam, a tall violinist with round glasses that kept slipping down his nose. "When I get stuck, sometimes I have to step away for a day or two." "I don't have time for that," Sophia replied. "The showcase is in 3 weeks and Professor Chen expects perfection." The third student, Jen, peered at the sheet music. "Could be worse. At least you don't have to play the Tchaikovsky violin concerto." "My fingers are practically bleeding." Sophia wasn't really listening. She began again, determined to push through the difficult passage, but her frustration made her fingers clumsy. The notes came out harsh and jarring, like stones skipping across the piano keys. "It should flow like water," came a quiet voice from behind them. The 4 students turned in surprise. The janitor had paused in his work, his mop held loosely in weathered hands. He seemed embarrassed at having spoken and quickly looked down. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Please continue." Sophia felt a flash of irritation. Who was this man to offer advice on one of the most challenging piano concertos ever written? "Oh, and you know Rachmaninoff?" she asked, her voice sharp with sarcasm. The janitor shook his head slightly but didn't look up. "Just a thought. The passage, it's not about technique alone. It tells a story." The students exchanged glances. Liam suppressed a smile. Priya looked uncomfortable. Sophia felt her cheeks grow warm. It wasn't the first time the janitor had overheard her practicing, but he'd never commented before. Something about his quiet confidence annoyed her. "A story?" she repeated, swiveling on the bench to face him fully. "And what story would that be?" The old man hesitated, seeming to regret having spoken. "It's about longing," he said finally, his accent more noticeable now. "About reaching for something just beyond your grasp." An awkward silence fell over the practice hall. The janitor resumed his mopping, moving farther away from the piano. "Well, that's deep coming from a man who cleans floors for a living," Sophia said, just loudly enough for her friends to hear. Priya elbowed her sharply, but Jen snickered. Sophia turned back to the piano, emboldened by her small audience. "You know what? I bet even Rachmaninoff struggled with this part. It's practically impossible to play perfectly." Her fingers danced over the keys again, and again she faltered at the same passage. Frustration bubbled up inside her, and she slammed her hands down on the keyboard, producing a discordant clash that echoed through the hall. "That's it," she announced, standing up suddenly. "I need a break before I break this piano." Her friends laughed, and Sophia, feeling theatrical, swept her arm toward the instrument. "This concerto is impossible. I hereby declare that anyone who can play this passage perfectly, right now without practice, I will marry on the spot." It was a ridiculous statement, meant to highlight the difficulty of the piece and draw more laughter from her friends. And laugh they did, the sound bouncing off the high ceiling of the practice hall, all except the janitor, who had stopped mopping again and was looking at the piano with an unreadable expression. "That's quite a promise." "Miss Reyes," came a new voice from the doorway. Professor Chen, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, stood watching them with raised eyebrows. The students straightened up immediately. Professor Chen was not known for her sense of humor. "Just a joke," Sophia explained quickly. "This concerto is driving me crazy." Said Professor Chen, walking toward them. "Perhaps you need to approach it differently. It's not meant to be conquered like an enemy, but embraced like a dance partner." Sophia nodded, though privately she thought the advice sounded like something from a fortune cookie. "I'll keep working on it," she promised. "Good," said Professor Chen. She glanced at the janitor who had resumed his work in the far corner. "And I suggest you all show more respect for everyone at this conservatory. We each have our own paths." With that cryptic comment, she turned and left the hall, her footsteps echoing behind her. "What was that about?" Liam wondered aloud. Sophia shrugged. "Who knows? She always talks in riddles." She gathered her sheet music and slipped it into her bag. "I need coffee before my next class. Anyone want to join?" As they headed toward the door, Sophia glanced back at the janitor. He was still mopping, his movements slow and methodical as if each sweep required careful thought. For a moment she felt a twinge of guilt about her comment, but she quickly pushed it aside. What did a janitor know about Rashmaninoff anyway? The students' voices faded as they left the practice hall, their laughter echoing down the corridor. The janitor, Eduardo Vega, though none of the students had ever bothered to learn his name, continued his work in silence. When the hall was empty, he paused, leaning on his mop as he looked at the grand piano sitting in a pool of late-afternoon sunlight. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, lingered on the instrument. For a moment his weathered hands twitched slightly as if remembering the feel of keys beneath his fingers. Then he sighed, a soft sound full of memories, and resumed his mopping. The showcase was in 3 weeks. He had much to prepare and not just clean floors. Outside the practice hall, Sophia and her friends crossed the conservatory's elegant courtyard. Their conversation already moved on to weekend plans and upcoming exams. None of them noticed Professor Chen watching from her office window, or the knowing smile that played across her lips as her gaze shifted between the departing students and the practice hall where Eduardo worked alone. The challenge had been made in jest, a moment of frustrated bravado, but some promises, even those made in laughter, have a way of shaping the future in ways no one can predict. And sometimes the most extraordinary talents hide in the most ordinary disguises, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows into the spotlight. For Eduardo, that moment was coming. After 30 years of silence, the music that had been locked inside him stirred once more, like a sleeping giant slowly awakening. The girl's careless promise had struck a chord deep within him, one that would soon resonate through the halls of Whitmore Conservatory and change both their lives forever. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver light through the windows of Whitmore Conservatory. The building stood quiet and empty, the halls that buzzed with activity during the day now silent. Almost everyone had gone home hours ago. Students to their dorms, professors to their apartments, administrators to their families. But Eduardo Vega remained. He moved through the darkened main hall, not with a mop this time, but with a cloth, carefully dusting the grand piano that Sophia Reyes had abandoned in frustration earlier that day. His touch was gentle, reverent even, as he wiped down the gleaming black surface. When he finished, he stood for a long moment, simply looking at the instrument. 30 years had passed since he'd performed on a stage, 30 years since his fingers had danced across piano keys before an audience, 30 years of silence, of hiding, of being invisible. Eduardo glanced around the empty hall, listening for any sound that might indicate he wasn't alone. Nothing but the faint tick of the old clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the building settling around him. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the piano bench. He didn't touch the keys right away. Instead, he closed his eyes and placed his hands in his lap, feeling the weight of memory press down on him. In his mind, he could see the concert hall in Buenos Aires packed with people. He could hear the orchestra behind him, the conductor's quiet count before they began. With a deep breath, Eduardo lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the empty hall, the same piece Sophia had struggled with. But under Eduardo's touch, the music flowed like water, each note clear and purposeful. When he reached the passage that had frustrated Sophia, his fingers moved with confidence, drawing out the melody with a depth of feeling that spoke of longing and loss. "It's about reaching for something just beyond your grasp," he had told her. What he hadn't said was that he understood that feeling better than most. As he played, Eduardo's mind drifted back to Argentina, to a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. He had been known as Eduardo Vega Montenegro then, a rising star in the classical music world. The son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher, his talent had been discovered when he was just 6 years old, picking out melodies on an old upright piano at his school. By 20, he was performing with major orchestras. By 30, he was being compared to the greats. Then came the military coup of 1976. The junta that seized power viewed artists and intellectuals with suspicion. Eduardo had never been political, but he had friends who were writers, painters, professors who spoke out against the new regime. One by one, they began to disappear. He kept his head down, focused on his music. But then came the night when soldiers interrupted a concert, dragging away a violinist from the orchestra, a man who had done nothing more than sign a petition calling for elections. After the concert, Eduardo was approached by a government official who made it clear he could continue his career, but only if he publicly supported the regime. If he refused, his name would be added to the list of the disappeared. That night, Eduardo went home and told his wife, Lucia, what had happened. They had a 3-year-old daughter, Isabella. By morning, they had made their decision. They fled with only what they could carry, leaving behind their home, their possessions, their identities. Through a network of sympathetic contacts, they made their way to the United States, where Eduardo became simply Ed Vega, a man with a past he couldn't talk about and skills he couldn't use without drawing attention. He took whatever work he could find. Dishwasher, night watchman, factory worker. Lucia, who had been a literature professor, cleaned houses. They lived in small apartments in forgettable neighborhoods, always looking over their shoulders, always afraid that even from thousands of miles away, the junta could reach them. Music became Eduardo's private solace. He would play softly at night after Isabella had gone to bed, on an old keyboard with headphones so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Sometimes Lucia would sit beside him, her head on his shoulder, listening through one earpiece as he played the pieces they had once attended in grand concert halls. Years passed. The junta eventually fell, democracy returned to Argentina, but by then, Eduardo and Lucia had built a life in the shadows. Isabella was an American teenager who barely remembered the country of her birth. Their old identities felt like characters in a story someone else had written. When Isabella left for college, Eduardo and Lucia moved once more, this time to a small town with a prestigious music conservatory. Lucia suggested Eduardo apply for a teaching position, but he shook his head. Too many questions, too many connections to a past he had spent decades hiding. Instead, he applied for a position as a janitor. No one asked many questions of the quiet immigrant with calloused hands who kept the floors clean and the lights working. No one expected him to be anything more than what he appeared to be. For 10 years, he had worked at Whitmore, watching young musicians chase the dream he had abandoned. Some, like Sophia Reyes, had raw talent but lacked the depth that comes only through living. Others had feeling but lacked technical skill. A rare few had both, and those were the ones Eduardo paid special attention to, sometimes leaving sheet music on their stands, anonymous suggestions from someone they never noticed. Lucia had passed away 3 years ago, a quiet death in her sleep. She had been his anchor, his reason for remaining in the shadows. With her gone, Eduardo felt increasingly restless, as if the music he had kept locked inside for decades was fighting to escape. His fingers moved over the keys, the Rachmaninoff concerto building to its powerful climax. He played with his eyes closed, transported back to another life, another time. The music filled the empty hall, bouncing off the high ceiling, wrapping around the rows of chairs, seeping into the very walls of the building. He didn't hear the door open at the back of the hall, didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows, listening. When the final notes faded away, Eduardo sat motionless, his hands resting lightly on the keys, his eyes still closed. The silence that followed seemed almost sacred. I always wondered if you would play again. Eduardo's eyes snapped open. Professor Chen stood a few yards away, a small smile on her face. I'm sorry, he said automatically, rising from the bench. I was just... Please, she said, holding up a hand. Don't apologize. Not for that. Never for that. Eduardo sank back onto the bench, suddenly feeling very tired. You know, he said. It wasn't a question. Professor Chen nodded. I recognized you the day you applied for the job. I was in the audience in Chicago, 1981. One of your last performances before you disappeared. You never said anything. It wasn't my place, she replied simply. We all have our reasons for the paths we choose. She walked closer, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. But I have to say, hearing you play just now, it seems wrong for such talent to remain hidden. Eduardo shook his head. That part of my life is over, is it? Professor Chen asked softly. The way you just played that piece, the same one Miss Reyes was struggling with today, suggests otherwise. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Eduardo spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I haven't performed in 30 years. Perhaps it's time to consider changing that, Professor Chen suggested. The annual showcase is in 3 weeks. Our headline performer, Anton Yegorov, has a program of Rachmaninoff prepared. Eduardo looked up sharply. What are you suggesting? Nothing, she said with a small shrug. Just making an observation. Anton is getting older. His hands trouble him in cold weather. It would be prudent to have an alternative should the need arise. Before Eduardo could respond, she turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back. Your secret is safe with me, Mr. Vega. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves sooner or later. Sometimes it's better when we choose the moment ourselves. The door closed behind her, leaving Eduardo alone once more. He turned back to the piano, running his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. 3 weeks until the showcase. 3 weeks until Sophia Reyes would attempt to play the very piece he had just performed in the darkness. Anyone who can play this perfectly, she had laughed. I will marry on the spot. A small smile tugged at the corner of Eduardo's mouth. Not because he took the girl's careless promise seriously, but because for the first time in decades, he felt something stirring within him, something he had thought long dead. Hope. He closed the piano lid gently and stood. It was late, and he still had the east wing to clean before morning. But as he picked up his mop and bucket, his mind was filled not with thoughts of floors to wash but of music long silenced, waiting to be heard again. The day of the annual showcase arrived with a flurry of activity at Whitmore Conservatory. Students rushed through the hallways in formal attire, carrying instrument cases and sheet music. Staff members hung last-minute decorations and arranged flowers on pedestals throughout the main hall. Eduardo moved among them quietly, polishing door handles, straightening chairs, and making sure everything gleamed. No one paid him much attention. He was just part of the background, as familiar and overlooked as the paintings on the walls. Only Professor Chen gave him a knowing nod as she passed, clipboard in hand, checking off final preparations. Sophia Reyes arrived 2 hours early, dressed in a deep blue gown that shimmered under the lights. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant twist, but her face betrayed her nervousness. For 3 weeks she had practiced the Rachmaninoff concerto until her fingers ached, determined to master the passage that had given her so much trouble. She had improved, certainly, but perfection still eluded her. She wouldn't be performing the piece tonight. That honor belonged to Anton Yegorov, the renowned Russian pianist who was the showcase's headline performer. Sophia's slot was earlier in the program, playing a less demanding Chopin piece. Still, she felt the pressure of performing before the conservatory's most important audience of the year. Donors, music critics, family members, and talent scouts from major orchestras. How are you feeling? Priya asked, finding Sophia in the practice room where she was warming up. Like I might throw up, Sophia admitted, flexing her fingers. You? Same, Priya laughed, adjusting her violin case strap on her shoulder. But hey, at least we're not Anton, did you hear? Sophia looked up sharply. Hear what? He's not here yet. His flight was delayed or something. Professor Chen is trying not to panic, but everyone can tell she's worried. He'll make it, Sophia said with more confidence than she felt. Anton Yegorov was the showcase's main attraction. His name on the program had drawn critics from as far away as New York and Chicago. Without him, the evening would be a disaster. As the start time approached, the audience began to file in. The main hall transformed from a practice space into a concert venue, filled with well-dressed patrons. Programs rustled as people found their seats. The buzz of conversation grew as more guests arrived. Backstage, the mood was tense. Students peeked through the curtains, counting the number of people in the audience. Professor Chen paced back and forth, checking her watch every few minutes. "Any word from Anton?" Sophia asked when she passed by. Professor Chen shook her head grimly. "His flight landed an hour ago. He should be here any minute." But minutes ticked by and the Russian pianist didn't appear. 10 minutes before the showcase was scheduled to begin, Professor Chen gathered the performers backstage. "We have a situation," she said, her voice low and controlled, despite the worry in her eyes. "Anton is still not here. His agent just called. Apparently he's having severe pain in his hands. Arthritis flaring up due to the weather and stress of travel. He's at his hotel and won't be able to perform tonight." A collective gasp went up from the gathered students. The headline performer, the main attraction, the reason many in the audience had come, gone. "What are we going to do?" someone asked. Professor Chen took a deep breath. "We proceed with the program as planned, minus Anton's performance. We'll extend intermission and add an impromptu faculty performance to fill some time. I've already spoken with Professor Grayson and he's agreed to play." The students exchanged glances. Professor Grayson was a gifted pianist, certainly, but he wasn't Anton Yegorov. He wouldn't draw the same reaction from the critics, wouldn't impress the donors in the same way. "What about the Rachmaninoff?" Sophia asked. "That's what everyone's expecting to hear." "Unfortunately, none of our faculty are prepared to perform that piece tonight," Professor Chen replied. "We'll have to disappoint on that front." The first warning bell rang, signaling that the showcase would begin in 5 minutes. The students scattered to make final preparations, leaving Professor Chen alone. Or so she thought. "I could play it," came a quiet voice from the shadows. Professor Chen turned to find Eduardo standing there, still in his janitor's uniform, a mop in his hand. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. Eduardo nodded slowly. "If you think it would help." A small smile played at the corner of Professor Chen's mouth. "I think it would help very much indeed." She glanced at his uniform. "Though we might need to find you something more suitable to wear." 20 minutes later, the showcase was underway. The audience, though disappointed to learn that Anton Yegorov would not be performing, politely applauded each student as they took their turn on stage. Sophia played her Chopin piece beautifully, drawing enthusiastic applause. Priya's violin solo was equally well received. As intermission approached, rumors began to spread among the performers backstage. Professor Chen had announced a last-minute replacement for Anton, not Professor Grayson as originally planned, but someone else. "Someone none of the students knew. Who is it?" Liam asked, peering around the curtain to get a look at the program Professor Chen was discussing with one of the ushers. "I heard it's someone from another conservatory," Jen suggested. "A favor to Professor Chen." Sophia said nothing, but a strange feeling had settled in her stomach. She thought of the janitor, Eduardo, and the way he had spoken about the Rachmaninoff piece 3 weeks ago. "It tells a story," he had said, "about longing, about reaching for something just beyond your grasp." How had he known that? How had he understood what she had failed to grasp after weeks of practice? Intermission came and went. The audience returned to their seats, curious about the mysterious replacement for the evening's headline performer. The lights dimmed and Professor Chen walked onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "As you know, we are deeply disappointed that Anton Yegorov is unable to perform for us tonight. However, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have secured a last-minute replacement. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you a pianist of remarkable talent, who has not performed publicly in many years. Please welcome Eduardo Vega." A polite smattering of applause greeted the unfamiliar name. The audience members exchanged confused glances. Who was Eduardo Vega? Why had they never heard of him? And then a figure walked onto the stage, and Sophia felt her breath catch in her throat. It was the janitor. But not as she had ever seen him before. Gone was the gray uniform, replaced by a borrowed tuxedo that fit him surprisingly well. Gone was the stooped posture and downcast eyes. The man who walked to the center of the stage moved with quiet dignity, his head held high. He bowed slightly to the audience, then turned and bowed to Professor Chen, who smiled and stepped off the stage. Without fanfare, he seated himself at the grand piano, adjusted the bench and placed his hands on the keys. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then he began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 filled the hall, and Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. This was the piece she had struggled with for weeks, the piece she had jokingly promised to marry anyone who could play perfectly. And the janitor, Eduardo, was playing it as if he had written it himself. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace and assurance that spoke of years of mastery. The difficult passages that had frustrated Sophia flowed effortlessly under his touch. But it wasn't just technical perfection. There was something more, something that reached beyond skill into the realm of pure emotion. Sophia stood in the wings, transfixed. She watched Eduardo's face as he played, saw the decades fall away, saw the young concert pianist emerge from beneath the disguise of the humble janitor. The audience sat in stunned silence at first, then leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the unexpected brilliance unfolding before them. When Eduardo reached the passage that had given Sophia so much trouble, he played it with such feeling that several people in the audience were seen to wipe away tears. Backstage, students and faculty gathered in the wings, drawn by the music. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply listened, witnesses to a moment of transformation none of them would ever forget. As the piece built toward its climax, Eduardo's body seemed to become part of the music, swaying slightly, his head sometimes nodding with the rhythm, his face reflecting every emotion in the score. This wasn't just a performance, it was a confession, a return, a reclaiming of something long lost. And as Sophia watched, she understood what he had tried to tell her weeks ago. The music wasn't just notes on a page to be conquered through technical skill. It was a language of the soul, speaking of experiences lived, loves lost, dreams deferred but never abandoned. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, as if awakening from a spell, the audience erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and delight. The applause grew louder, accompanied by cheers and calls of "Bravo!" Eduardo sat motionless at the piano for a moment, his head bowed, his hands still resting on the keys. Then slowly he stood and turned to face the audience. He bowed deeply, a smile of quiet joy illuminating his face. Sophia stood frozen in the wings, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had never heard anything like it, never felt anything like it. It was as if Eduardo had played not just the piano, but the hearts of everyone in the room. "Who is he?" Priya whispered beside her. "How did we not know?" Sophia shook her head, unable to speak. She thought of her careless words, her dismissive laughter, her arrogant challenge. She thought of the quiet man mopping the floors, listening to her struggle with a piece he could play with his eyes closed. As Eduardo took another bow, his gaze swept toward the wings where the students stood watching. For a brief moment his eyes met Sophia's, and she saw in them neither triumph nor accusation, but a simple, gentle understanding. In that moment, something changed inside Sophia Reyes. Something fundamental shifted, like a key turning in a lock, opening a door she hadn't known existed. And as the applause continued to thunder through the hall, she knew her life would never be quite the same again. The morning after the showcase, Whitmore Conservatory hummed with excited conversation. Students gathered in hallways, whispering behind their hands. Faculty members huddled in the staff room, their coffee cooling as they talked. Everyone was discussing the same thing: Eduardo Vega, the janitor who had stunned them all with his extraordinary performance. Did you know? Had you ever heard him play before? Where did he learn to play like that? Why was he working as a janitor when he can play Rachmaninoff like that? The questions buzzed through the building like electricity, but Eduardo himself was nowhere to be found. Sophia arrived at the conservatory earlier than usual, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. She had barely slept, the memory of Eduardo's performance playing on repeat in her thoughts. She had come hoping to find him, though she wasn't entirely sure what she would say when she did. Looking for someone? Professor Chen appeared beside Sophia as she peered into the main hall, which was empty except for the grand piano, now closed and silent. Sophia jumped slightly. I was wondering where Eduardo might be. Professor Chen smiled knowingly. He took the day off. First time in 10 years, from what I understand. Oh. Sophia tried to hide her disappointment. Do you think? Will he be back? That, said Professor Chen, is the question everyone's asking, including some very important people. She nodded toward her office. I've already had calls from 3 major orchestras and a recording company. Word travels fast in the music world, especially when something extraordinary happens. Sophia followed Professor Chen's gaze to her office, where the phone was already ringing again. But he's just a janitor, she said, then immediately regretted her words. Professor Chen gave her a sharp look. Is he? After what you witnessed last night, can you still say that? Sophia flushed with shame. No, I didn't mean it that way. Eduardo Vega was one of the most promising pianists of his generation, Professor Chen said quietly. I saw him perform in Chicago years ago. There were rumors afterward that he had fled Argentina during the military dictatorship, that he had gone into hiding. Then nothing. He simply vanished from the classical music world until last night. She studied Sophia's face for a moment. The question isn't whether Eduardo will come back to the conservatory. Miss Reyes, the question is whether you've learned anything from this experience. Without waiting for a response, Professor Chen turned and walked back to her office, leaving Sophia alone with her thoughts. Throughout the day, Sophia went through the motions of her classes, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Eduardo, not just his stunning performance, but the quiet dignity with which he had been doing his job all these years. How many times had she walked past him without really seeing him? How many times had she treated him as if he were invisible? When afternoon came, Sophia found herself back in the main practice hall, sitting at the same piano where everything had begun 3 weeks ago. She placed her fingers on the keys and tried once more to play the passage that had given her so much trouble. It still wasn't perfect, but somehow that didn't seem to matter as much anymore. You're getting closer, came a voice from the doorway. Sophia turned to see Eduardo standing there. He was back in his janitor's uniform, a cleaning cart beside him, but something had changed. He stood straighter and his eyes met hers directly. Eduardo, she said, standing quickly. We've all been wondering where you were. I needed some time to think, he replied, moving into the room. Things have become complicated. Professor Chen said people have been calling about you. Orchestras, recording companies. Eduardo nodded, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. Yes. After 30 years of silence, suddenly everyone wants to hear Eduardo Vega play again. He smiled faintly. It's strange how life works sometimes. Sophia took a deep breath. Why did you hide who you were? All these years working here, listening to students like me struggle with pieces you could play in your sleep? Eduardo was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked over to the piano and ran his fingers lightly over the polished wood. When I left Argentina, I left everything behind. My career, my identity, even in some ways my love for music. It became painful to play. Each note reminded me of what I had lost. He looked up at Sophia. And then, as years passed, it became easier to stay hidden, to be invisible. But you weren't invisible, Sophia said. Not really. You heard me that day, talking about the Rachmaninoff. You understood what I was missing. Music speaks to those who know how to listen, Eduardo said simply. You have talent, Sophia, real talent. But you were playing with your fingers, not your heart. Sophia felt tears pricking at her eyes. I know that now. After hearing you play, she trailed off, then forced herself to continue. I was so arrogant. The things I said that day about marrying anyone who could play the piece perfectly. I didn't know. I'm sorry, Eduardo smiled, genuine warmth in his eyes. There's nothing to be sorry for. We all have moments of pride, of foolishness. What matters is how we grow from them. A commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Voices approached, one of them distinctly Professor Chen's. He might be in here. He was asking about the practice schedule earlier. The door swung open and Professor Chen entered, followed by 2 men in expensive suits and a woman clutching a leather portfolio. Ah, Eduardo. Good you're here, Professor Chen said, looking relieved. These gentlemen are from the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and Ms. Winters is from Harmonia Records. They're very eager to speak with you." The visitors surged forward, hands extended, voices overlapping as they introduced themselves. Sophia stepped back, watching as Eduardo was surrounded by people who saw in him what she had failed to see. A brilliant artist who had been hiding in plain sight. "Mr. Vega, we would be honored if you would consider a guest performance with our orchestra next month," one of the men was saying. "Harmonia would like to discuss a recording contract," added the woman. "A comeback album. Rachmaninoff, perhaps, given the response to your performance last night." Eduardo looked slightly overwhelmed by the attention, his eyes darting around the circle of eager faces. Then unexpectedly his gaze found Sophia's across the room. Something passed between them. An understanding. A question. A moment of connection. "I appreciate your interest," Eduardo said, turning back to the visitors. "But this is all happening very quickly. I need some time to consider my options." Of course," the record executive said, pressing a business card into his hand. "But please don't wait too long. News of your performance is spreading. You're going to have many offers." After a few more minutes of conversation, Professor Chen tactfully guided the visitors out, promising Eduardo would be in touch soon. When the door closed behind them, silence fell over the practice hall once more. "So," Sophia said after a moment, "it seems Eduardo Vega is making a comeback." Eduardo sighed, looking down at the business cards in his hand. "Perhaps. I don't know yet. But it's what you want, isn't it? To play again? To be recognized for your talent? What I want," Eduardo said slowly, "is to be true to myself. For 30 years I've lived as someone else. The question now is whether Eduardo Vega the pianist still exists, or if he died in Argentina all those years ago." Sophia moved closer to the piano, her fingers trailing along its edge. "He exists. I heard him last night." Everyone did. A small smile lifted the corner of Eduardo's mouth. "Perhaps you're right." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "I should get back to work. There are still floors to clean, regardless of what happened last night." "That's it?" Sophia asked, surprised. "You're just going to go back to mopping floors after what happened?" "For now," Eduardo replied with a shrug. "Until I decide what comes next." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, I'm giving a small masterclass tomorrow afternoon." Professor Chen suggested it. Just a few students who might benefit from some different perspectives on their playing. "Would you be interested in attending?" Sophia felt a surge of emotion. Gratitude, humility, excitement. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that very much." Eduardo nodded, a gentle understanding in his eyes. "Tomorrow, then. 2:00 in Professor Chen's studio." He picked up his mop and bucket. "In the meantime, keep working on that passage. Remember, it's about longing, about reaching for something just beyond your grasp." As he walked away, Sophia turned back to the piano. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys once more. This time, as she began to play, she thought not about the technical challenges of the piece, but about its meaning, about longing, about loss, about the courage it takes to reach for something that seems impossible to attain. Her fingers moved over the keys with a new awareness, a new sensitivity. The music wasn't perfect, not yet, but it had something it had lacked before. It had heart. Outside in the hallway, Eduardo paused, listening to Sophia play. A smile spread across his face, not the polite, guarded smile he had worn for years as the invisible janitor, but a real smile that reached his eyes and erased decades of hiding. Something had changed at Whitmore Conservatory. A door that had been closed for 30 years was opening again, not just for Eduardo Vega, but for a young pianist who was beginning to understand that true music comes not from the fingers, but from the soul. 6 months had passed since the night Eduardo Vega stepped onto the stage at Whitmore Conservatory and changed everything. Spring had given way to summer, and summer had faded into a crisp autumn. The leaves outside the conservatory windows had turned golden and red, drifting down to carpet the courtyard where students gathered between classes. The conservatory itself had changed too. Eduardo's story had brought unexpected attention. Articles in music magazines, features on arts programs, even a short documentary by a local filmmaker. Applications for the next year had doubled. Tours often paused in the main hall, where guides would point to the grand piano and tell visitors. That's where Eduardo Vega made his comeback after 30 years. Eduardo himself had undergone the most visible transformation. He was no longer the janitor who faded into the background, but a distinguished member of the faculty. Professor Chen had created a special position for him, artist in residence with a small teaching load that left him time for his rapidly reviving performance career. The record deal with Harmonia had come through. His first album in 3 decades, a collection of Rachmaninoff pieces, had been released the previous month to glowing reviews. There had been performances too, first with the Boston Symphony as a guest soloist, then a small tour of prestigious venues along the East Coast. Music critics wrote of the triumphant return of a lost genius and a voice of profound emotion, matured by decades of silence. Yet despite the accolades and opportunities, Eduardo maintained a certain humility. He still lived in his modest apartment near the conservatory. He still wore simple clothes, spoke softly, and sometimes helped the maintenance staff when they were short-handed, not because he had to, but because it felt right to him. Of all the students at Whitmore, none had been more affected by Eduardo's emergence than Sophia Reyes. The arrogant young woman who had once dismissed the janitor now spent hours in his studio, soaking up his wisdom, relearning everything she thought she knew about music. It hadn't been easy at first. After that initial master class, Sophia had struggled with feelings of shame whenever she faced Eduardo. But he had never mentioned her previous behavior, never held it against her. Instead, he had focused entirely on helping her grow as a musician and as a person. Under his guidance, Sophia's playing had transformed. The technical brilliance was still there, but now it served something deeper, an emotional connection to the music that had been missing before. Her fellow students had noticed the change, not just in her playing but in her demeanor. The competitive edge had softened. The need to prove herself had given way to a genuine desire to express something meaningful through her music. On this particular afternoon, the conservatory was buzzing with anticipation. Eduardo was giving his first formal recital in the main hall, not as a last-minute replacement, but as the featured artist. The program was ambitious, an evening of Rachmaninoff, concluding with the Piano Concerto No. 3 that had started everything 6 months earlier. Sophia had arrived early to practice in one of the small studios. Her own recital was coming up in 2 weeks, and Eduardo had helped her select a challenging program that showcased her growth over the past months. As she played, she found herself thinking about how much had changed. How much she had changed. Since that day when she had mockingly promised to marry anyone who could play the Rachmaninoff perfectly, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Eduardo standing in the doorway, dressed in a formal suit for his upcoming performance. "I thought I might find you here," he said with a warm smile. "How's the Debussy coming along?" Sophia returned the smile. "Better, I think. I'm finally feeling the flow of it rather than just hitting the right notes. That's what I like to hear." He stepped into the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "I wanted to see you before the recital. I have something for you." From behind his back, he produced a single red rose and held it out to her. Sophia looked at the flower in surprise, then back at Eduardo's face. "What's this for?" "A remembrance," he said softly. 6 months ago today, a young pianist made a careless promise about marrying anyone who could play a certain piece perfectly. His eyes twinkled with gentle humor. I thought perhaps the anniversary deserved a small acknowledgement. Sophia felt her cheeks grow warm, but she accepted the rose with a small laugh. "I can't believe you remembered the exact date. How could I forget? It was the day that set everything in motion." Eduardo's expression grew more serious. "I've been thinking a lot about that day recently, about how the smallest moments can change the course of our lives." Sophia twirled the rose between her fingers, nodding thoughtfully. "If I hadn't been struggling with that passage, if you hadn't overheard me, if Professor Chen hadn't recognized me when I applied for the job 10 years ago," Eduardo added, "if Anton Yegorov's hands hadn't troubled him that night." He shook his head in wonder. So many tiny threads weaving together to create the fabric of our lives. They were quiet for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Sophia looked up, meeting Eduardo's gaze directly. "I never properly apologized for how I acted that day," she said. "I was arrogant and dismissive. I treated you like you were less than me somehow. I'm truly sorry for that." Eduardo waved away her apology. "It's long forgotten. What matters is who you are becoming, not who you once were." Still, Sophia insisted, I want you to know that I understand now what you were trying to tell me. About music being a language of the soul. About playing with the heart, not just the fingers. She smiled ruefully.
I wish I'd listened sooner. Eduardo nodded, acknowledging her words.
We all learn in our own time, in our own way. Some lessons can't be taught, they must be experienced. He glanced at his watch. I should go. There are a few things I need to prepare before the recital. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Will you be watching tonight? From the front row, Sophia promised. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Hours later, the main hall was packed with people. Every seat was filled, and latecomers stood at the back, eager to witness Eduardo Vega's official return to the stage. The audience included students, faculty, music critics, and even a few famous performers who had come to pay respects to a long-lost colleague. Sophia sat in the front row between Priya and Liam, her hands folded in her lap, the red rose tucked into her program. As the lights dimmed and Eduardo walked onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. He acknowledged them with a modest bow, then seated himself at the piano, the same piano where Sophia had once practiced, where he had secretly played in the empty hall late at night. The recital was magnificent. Eduardo played with the technical precision that came from decades of practice, but it was the emotion behind the notes that held the audience spellbound. Each piece told a story, of loss and exile, of silence and return, of redemption and renewal. When he reached the final piece, Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, a hush fell over the hall. This was the piece that had brought Eduardo back into the spotlight, the piece that had humbled Sophia and transformed her understanding of what music could be. As his fingers moved across the keys, Sophia found herself transported. The music seemed to speak directly to her heart, telling her things that words could never express. And when he reached that particular passage, the one she had struggled with for so long, she felt tears spring to her eyes at the beauty and depth he brought to it. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of perfect silence before the audience rose to their feet as one, applauding wildly. Eduardo stood and bowed, his face alight with joy. After several curtain calls, he raised his hands to quiet the audience. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with emotion. For 30 years I lived without music, or rather with music locked inside me, unable to escape. To be here tonight, sharing it with you again. He paused, overcome for a moment. It is a gift I never thought I would receive. The applause redoubled. Flowers were brought to the stage. Critics could be seen scribbling notes, already composing the rave reviews that would appear the next day. As Eduardo took his final bow, his eyes sought out Sophia in the front row. Their gazes met across the distance, a silent understanding passing between them. She lifted the red rose in a small salute, and he nodded in acknowledgement. The following week, as preparations for Sophia's own recital intensified, she found herself working late in the practice room. Eduardo had stopped by earlier to give her some final advice, but now she was alone, running through her program one last time. When she finished, a soft sound from the doorway made her turn. Professor Chen stood there, a thoughtful expression on her face. That was beautiful, Miss Reyes, she said. I've been watching your progress these past months. The change in your playing is remarkable. Thank you, Sophia replied. I've had an incredible teacher. Professor Chen nodded. Eduardo has a gift for bringing out the best in his students, just as you had a gift for bringing out the best in him. Sophia looked up in surprise. Me, but I was the one who challenged him, who unwittingly created the situation that brought him back to music. Professor Chen smiled. Sometimes the people who change our lives the most are not those who set out to do so, but those who simply cross our paths at exactly the right moment. She moved into the room, running her hand along the edge of the piano. Eduardo is leaving next month, you know. Just temporarily. Harmonia wants him to record a second album in New York, and there's talk of a European tour afterward. Sophia nodded. Eduardo had mentioned it in their last lesson. He's asked me to consider applying for a special program in Vienna next year, she said. He thinks I'm ready. And are you? Ready,